This new report that we're releasing from RUSI called Regenerating Warfighting Credibility Among European NATO Air Forces is essentially a study looking at what European NATO air forces, specifically as distinct from the United States, have in terms of challenges to get back to a stage where they can reliably threaten and, if necessary, actually fight a defensive war as one of the key components of a joint force in defense of NATO's eastern frontier against Russia. In light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the continued threat which Russia is gearing up to pose at both the political intent level and also in terms of its long-term mobilization and industrial mobilization strategies, Europe is forced to confront the fact that a peer threat from a state adversary is no longer something they can avoid to plan against going forwards, particularly as the United States is ever more fixed by the threat from a rising China, particularly in terms of Taiwan, in the coming years. Western Europe and indeed NATO as a whole have built their joint forces with the assumption that air superiority will be one of the first components of any military campaign. That has allowed NATO to field smaller, more efficient, far less casualty-dependent forces than other comparable powers such as Russia or China. And indeed, the benefits of the way that the West fights war, depending on air superiority, are being demonstrated in Ukraine today, where we see two forces fighting a war that are not designed to rely on air superiority and indeed cannot leverage it in that campaign due to the prevalence of ground-based air defenses. But the result is a relatively indecisive, very large-scale, unbelievably destructive and costly war on the ground, with hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides 1 year in. NATO not only cannot afford to, but would not wish to fight wars in this way, and therefore the current answer, which some are reaching for, of air superiority is no longer achievable because of, for example, the capability of ground-based air defenses, is not really a viable policy position for Western militaries. Therefore, we look at what NATO air forces in Europe have to do in order to return to where they were at the end of the Cold War as the most credible part of the alliance's joint fighting power. There are three areas of challenge that the report addresses. First of all, the vulnerability of basing. NATO air forces have, throughout multiple decades of predominantly counterinsurgency and intervention operations, where there was no serious peer threat or long-range threat to speak of, concentrated their fleets of aircraft on fewer and fewer bases, in general with no active hardening or defense measures in place. There are exceptions, such as the Swedish Air Force or Finnish Air Force, although they are not in the alliance yet. But in general, NATO's air power remains highly lethal, at least potentially in the air, but very vulnerable on the ground. So one section of the paper looks into the potential strategies to mitigate against this vulnerability going forward. The second component addressed by the report is the required pilot and aircrew competency more broadly to enable fast jets and the rest of the air power instrument to function in a high-end contested environment. One of the reasons that Russia has been unable to achieve air superiority in Ukraine is that its aircrew was simply not trained to employ and adequately exploit the, in many cases, very impressive technical capabilities of their aircraft and weapon systems. For many NATO air forces, unfortunately, this is also the case. While we have formidable hardware and formidable weapons, too often the aircrew are simply not able to get the number of flying hours, the number of high-end training opportunities and exercises to dedicate to honing their craft at the high end. Instead, the demand signal for fighting on contingent operations and performing politically motivated or industrially led deployments has eaten away aircrew availability, maintenance spares and availability, to the point that the core warfighting competencies that used to underpin most air forces in NATO are no longer things that most aircrew are comfortable with, and this needs to change. And the third key component that the report examines is the absolute requirement for a suppression and destruction of enemy air defenses, or SEAD-DEAD capability. This is because, as Ukraine has shown Russia, even a relatively modest modern air defense capability based on mobile SAMs, surface-to-air missile systems, is sufficient to deny even a fairly large and capable modern air force like Russia, at least on paper, the ability to operate over a contested area. For the Russian army, that shouldn't have necessarily been the end, because after all, they have all the firepower in the world in the form of artillery, tanks, and massed infantry. For NATO, of course, the denial of air superiority is much more serious as a potential danger, and therefore the report addresses what is required for SEAD-DIAD, why, and the unfortunate level of cost and specialization that will be required to build the appropriate munition stocks in order to pursue that mission set. Ultimately, this report is about giving policymakers the reasons why they need to invest in reinvigorating NATO's combat air capabilities while Russia is distracted, caught up in Ukraine, and before they're able to re-establish a conventional threat to Europe. It's important that we do this now because lead times are long, and ultimately 3 to 5 years away is still next door when you look at combat air.